Exodus, last week, I would have 5 or 10 minutes less if we had got to hear George Evans ourselves this morning. I'm teasing. Sam loves it that now I'm teasing Mr. Brady, but this is great. I asked for this Baptist history stuff, and it's a great thing. It's good. It's as good as what we learn, except that it's not the Bible, so mine's better, I guess. But anyway, this morning's not much Bible. Again, we're going to have the historical context of Exodus, and yes, we just take this. I have a couple other verses, so if a couple of you, or if you want to turn to Acts chapter 7, we're going to refer to that in this morning's talk, and then Exodus 1 and Exodus, is it 2 or 4? But right there in the beginning of Exodus. So I'm going to hurry through what we talked about last week and then slow down a little bit and hopefully get through this information. First, as we talked about this historical context, I mentioned that there's difficulties lining up every place in the Bible where ages are mentioned. I mentioned that Egyptian chronology is confusing also, so a biblical chronology doesn't always match up. Egyptian chronology is confusing. What I'm presenting is a simplified, maybe an oversimplified, or I don't think it's oversimplified, but a simplified version. Main reason is that we're studying Exodus, not Egyptology, even though some of this is quite interesting. And I'm presenting a timeline that is accepted by many. So there's any timeline that you come up with is going to have people that say, well, what about this and what about this? This one is accepted by many. People in here might question it. Some of it I question, but it's just, in the end, I'm going with it because it fits the events that I know happened and the interactions that they had with the Egyptian officials fits this timeline. So I know what the Bible says is true, and how the dates and all that line up, maybe we won't ever know. Because as I mentioned last week, when we get to heaven, we might not be so concerned about which dates lined up with when. We can trust the biblical record. So we began talking about the 12th dynasty. Just kind of quickly, 12th dynasty is the time of when Abraham was born. Abraham visited Egypt during the 12th dynasty. Isaac was born during the 12th dynasty. Actually, right at the end of the 12th dynasty, Jacob and Esau were born. And then Egypt goes to an intermediate period called a second intermediate period. And these intermediate periods are times when there is not centralized authority. There might be a king here and a king there and a king there. And we think, wow, that doesn't make sense because we're used to these like rigid boundaries. But think of when Israel went into Canaan. How many kings did they defeat? I know they took down 31 cities. I think there was 31 kings. Now, if you look at Israel's about the size of what, New Jersey or Delaware or something, not very big. And there's 31 kings in that area. So that there would be, this idea, this helps us to just remember, we're talking about a totally different time and place, almost 4,000 years ago. Anyway, this intermediate period has generally two parallel areas in Egypt. There's the upper Egypt, which is southern because it's up the river, and lower Egypt, which is northern, that's closer to the Mediterranean. And there's these parallel dynasties going on during this second intermediate period. There's a 13th dynasty and a 14th dynasty, and a 17th dynasty. And then in the other area, there's a 15th and 16th dynasty. And it's during this time period that some pharaohs tended to have less authority and power in areas shifted to a prime minister. And in Lower Egypt, which is northern, we have the 15th dynasty. In Lower Egypt, the Hexose, which were an Asiatic or Semitic group of people, not Hamitic, not Egyptians, they kind of infiltrated down there, and more of them there, and pretty soon there was enough of them, they took over. They grew to actual political power. They're definitely different than Egyptians. You can see this in Egyptian artwork. with their hair and the way they care for themselves, even the types of clothes they wear. And we said that it's quite possible that the Pharaoh that lifted Joseph to power was a Hexose. He would have not been the same as, well, Joseph would have just been, there wasn't a Hebrew nation when Joseph came along. There was just Jacob, Israel, but not Israel, the country of Israel. He was just a family, a clansman. So this Hexose ruler could have looked at Joseph as he was a Semite, he was an Asiatic, and as somebody that was more similar to him and brilliant. He could tell him a dream that, so possible that he lifted him to power. So during this 15th dynasty, or the Hexose Dynasty, we have many things happening. So the Hexose Dynasty is generally 1720 to 1570, and about 1720 is the time that Jacob escaped to Haran from Esau and that. And it might surprise you that Jacob is, let's see if that's right. Let me look at my dates here. Well, that's even on a page before. Yeah. Jacob is 70 years old when he runs away. And if we work backward, he stood before Pharaoh at one point and said, I'm 130. The years of my life have been hard and whatever. If we work backward, it's pretty close. Jacob was the conniving 70-year-old who tricked his father. So it's just really something when we put ages on these guys. And that means Esau was the crybaby 70-year-old, right? Crying because he couldn't. Okay, so when we say, oh, he cried like a baby, I don't think so. He was 70 years old. So what we learned in fifth grade Sunday school, fifth grade Sunday school teachers, when we start adding years and dates to it, it gives us a little different picture. Anyway, Jacob flees to Haran about 1720. Joseph is born to Rachel probably around 1700. Jacob returns to Bethel about 1698, running away from Laban. And then Joseph is sold into Egypt around 1683. And I know I'm throwing those dates there. But around 1683, Joseph is probably 17 years old, and he's sold into Egypt. Several years later, sometime, we don't know exactly when, sometime between then and when Joseph is 30, he's falsely accused, sent to jail, and then tells the dream of the butler and the baker. That was 2 years before. He was lifted up out of jail. He was raised to power around 1670. And there's not a lot of historical record, which I'll explain why of this, but if we're looking at ages and dates, this is pretty much the time frame. That was Genesis 41. There is then, after Joseph comes to power, this 7 years of plenty. And the reason I'm going back here is because it seems like probably during this 7 years of plenty, there was just tremendous wealth and food and amounts of food and everything. The 17th dynasty down south in Upper Egypt grows more powerful. They begin to get to be powerful, and it seems like the plenty of that time period is an occasion for that. After that, 7 years, there's 2 years of famine, and then Jacob sojourns into Egypt. It seems like, Genesis tells us, they were starving, they went down for food, they came back, and when they went down again, seems to be like there was a year in between there, and they went at those times. So Jacob comes into Egypt about 1660, and that would mean that Jacob died in Egypt 1643, and that will bring us all the way to Joseph dying in 1590. Okay, so Joseph came to power at 30. He died at 130. Now, I don't know if he was the prime minister for 100 years, but he would have been the prime minister for a long time, and his family would have been held in high esteem as they were. Remember, there was a royal welcome when they came in, And you should not think that when Jacob came into Egypt, it was just Jacob and 70 people. It was probably Jacob and 1,000 people, easily. Maybe Jacob and 4,000 people. Let's just talk about that quick. Abraham had 318 trained men, servants, right? And in his household. Those men very likely had wives and children. It would be normal for that, okay? Who got all those people when Abraham died? Isaac. Isaac was already a wealthy man on his own. Who got all of Isaac's things when he died? Jacob. Jacob got the birthright and the blessing. Esau probably got some. So this is, when Jacob goes into Egypt, it's not 70 people. It's probably several thousand. 70 out of Jacob's loins listed there, but there's a whole bunch there. Anyway, so there's a lot of people, and this helps us understand what's probably happening here. So all that Jacob comes is they're Semites. They're not all Jacob's blood, but they're part of Jacob's clan, or whatever, his arrival. And he arrives to great welcome because his son has delivered the nation and is basically the ruler of the nation. Now, so 100 years later, then, this 17th dynasty that was growing in power down south has grown in power enough to drive the Hexose out. And the Hexose are, we said already that they are despised. They are not Egyptians. Egyptians don't like, some people enjoy the government, but they don't like, in the back of their mind, and plenty of other people are like, these aren't Egyptians. They shouldn't be ruling over us. Okay, so there's the 17th dynasty, the king of that at the current time, drives the Hyksos out. But the king of the 17th dynasty was killed in battle, and the 18th dynasty is then established. Well, that big king was killed. A major general of the 17th dynasty becomes the king, the Pharaoh, and establishes new family, new dynasty. And this is going to be the king that didn't know Joseph. So, and as is common in Egyptian history, and I think a lot of ancient history, the Hyksos dynasty is hated and eliminated somewhat, or greatly eliminated from historical records. A couple reasons. There's very little record here, and one of the reasons would be the Hyksos were not the sophisticated Egyptians. Egyptians had, they were into medicine and architecture and writing and all this, and the Hyksos were not as civilized, we might say. They were not interested in leaving a history behind, more like they were nomadic herdsmen type, rather than a settle down and build a lifestyle and a civilization type. And the later rulers, 18th dynasty rulers, later rulers, attempted to expunge the memory of them. So we get into the 18th dynasty, which is the beginning of a new kingdom period. We're ending this intermediate period with kings all over the place, and there's great centralized authority. And the first king of the 18th dynasty is Amos. Amos was that great general, and he finished driving out the Hyksos. Keep hitting this. He is also the first to establish a standing army. Before this time, if there was a problem, they'd it was more like a militia. He establishes a standing army. He purposely wants an army to keep these Hyksos that they drove out. So, and any other people that might attempt to take over the country. He's also the first in Egyptian history to use chariots, which is interesting. Several years later, we have chariots chasing the Israelites out of Egypt, but he's the first to add chariots to his army. And as I said, he's probably the king of verse 8 that says, 1 verse 8, now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph, And then let's read the rest of it. And he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, with who? Maybe these ones that they just drove out coming back. They join unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. So Amos is most likely the king that puts the Israelites into bondage. It was probably just 120 years since Joseph's elevation, just 20 years since his death. But Joseph has this strong association with the Hexose. His family is very strong. So his family is one that we also want to eliminate from our memories. So didn't know, it's not like didn't, but it'd be more like didn't respect, didn't have any respect, actually had great contempt for Joseph and anybody who would have given Joseph power. So Amos does this he rules for, man, my math is not good in backwards. 25 years? 25 years. And then his son is Amenhotep the first. He reigns for another 25 years, but probably there's not much historical record or stuff that's pertinent to us. Carries on, most likely, very well his father's intentions. Then we come to Tatmos. Tatmos the first has a short reign from 1524 to 1518, and he married into the royal family. So Amenhotep had no male heir, and in Egyptian government, males sat on the throne. They didn't really they didn't have queens. They had a man on the throne. But royalty passed through the females. Now, I don't understand all that, but that's just the way Egyptian lineage and royalty works. So you had to have a man to sit on the throne, but royalty passed through the female. So Amenhotep did not have a male heir. He had a daughter that was royalty, and Tatmos married his daughter, and so therefore he is now a king. And he's legitimately a king because royalty is through his wife, and he's the man sitting on the throne. He had successful military campaigns, but then he himself also had no royal sons. He had a daughter, and her name was Hatshepsut. It's likely that she is the daughter of Pharaoh that we read about in Exodus 2, verse 5, which says, and the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. So this is most likely, quite likely, the daughter of Pharaoh who rescued Moses from the waters. Now, Tatmos the first had a son, but she was from a minor wife. Now, I'm not going to get all into the drama of it, but we know from reading the Bible in ancient times there was lots of wives. I mean, Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines. So that's enough of my explanation. He had a minor wife and a son from a minor wife, and Tatmos the first arranged a marriage between Tatmos the second from his minor wife and his daughter from his royal wife. Okay? So half brother, half sister marry each other. Don't look silly at that. Okay? What did Abraham tell Pharaoh about Sarai? She's my sister, the daughter of my father, but not of my mother, or something like that. So again, ancient times, this is much more accepted. The law actually, in Exodus, kind of puts the kibosh on that and starts keeping that stuff out of these families. So Hatshepsut, and she is quite the person. Wow. I have to stop. I'm trying to go fast. hopefully not so fast that you've got whiplash. We'll come back to Hatshepsut. I wanted to be done with this in 2 weeks, but we'll finish it next week and possibly get into some other things. Hatshepsut, though, is very instrumental in this. She shows up in several iterations of this 18th dynasty, and as being the mother of Moses, brings us right into the story of Exodus. And so we'll talk about her and then the things coming off of her, and then we'll be into Exodus solidly and into the text of Exodus. Context is great, but the text is king. So let's pray together. Father, we